From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. Oral history is an increasingly popular method of recording the experiences of groups that may be left out of official documented archives or from national narratives. Today, we speak to Hannah, founder of the Queer Oral History Archive, on why she has embarked on this project to collect the stories of Singapore's LGBT community and how she hopes these stories will be used. So thanks very much, Hannah, for joining me today. Could you share with us how this archive came about?
It came from a lot of things. I guess the inciting incident, if you would call it that, is the whole Tea Freedom debacle. Okay, I should go into more detail about Tea Freedom first. So there's 4 wings. They're called Spectrum, Femme, Safe Word, and Let's Talk About Sex. And all of them have basically different aspects relating to feminism and LGBT advocacy. And wing that was involved here is Let's Talk About Sex because, I mean, as the name suggests, they hold conversations about sex and sexuality. And basically, they tried to do this event about rope bondage. And we're not sure exactly what happened, but I have interviewed some of the people involved in Tea Freedom in the archive. And basically what happened is that the group got infiltrated because they tried to publicize this event a bit more. And this kind of caused this whole moral panic towards Let's Talk About Sex and Tea Freedom in general. And what the university did was basically shut it down. It's effectively shut down right now, which is really sad because Let's Talk About Sex was this really good space. And I learned a lot from there. And so from that, I kind of realized that no one's going to record this because the queer history that we're given that we have in Singapore that's recorded down is very organizational. That or it's the wiki and official media things. And the history of student organizations like Tea Freedom don't really get recorded down. And I kind of came to that realization that no one's going to know anything about Let's Talk About Sex after my batch because it was shut down already. This kind of built up from a bunch of things I'd been thinking about previously. So the year before, I'd already started thinking about oral history because I took a couple history modules that mentioned it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I began thinking about it already. And I was thinking why is it that National Archives is the only source of oral history in Singapore? Because their search function kind of sucks. Basically, the whole Tea Freedom incidents kind of just combined together made me really think that we should really have a space for different kinds of oral histories because it's the National Archives by the nature of it. It has to be more, let's say, official. I won't say that it serves a state agenda or anything, but it definitely is a little more, I guess, stringent about who gets to be recorded and whose history gets to be told. And with things like the queer history of Singapore, they don't really get much of the official narrative that they really should. And so I just decided I could probably do some things. What I literally did to start this archive was make a Google account and buy a cheap microphone. And that was it. And then I just asked around for all my queer friends. And it just started from there.
So from the oral histories in your collections so far, what are some of the common themes that people talk about?
I'll have to start with saying that because of who I am and who my friends are, the oral histories in the archive are mostly from young people around university age. So in mostly talk, one of the big themes is about coming out and kind of the isolation you feel on figuring out what being queer is. and not having that much to look up to. You don't know where the community is or that you have a community. There was one interview that really said it well. They said that they felt like they were the only gay person in the world. That's a very common theme surrounding that. Like, especially in school, especially in secondary school, that's when most people figure it out because puberty and like you're realizing your sexuality. And basically, there's this huge feeling of isolation because everyone is straight and you don't know how to deal with it and you don't know how to express that. Actually, another common theme is about realizing who you are. I won't say self-actualization, but something similar to that, I guess. Yeah, coming to terms with being queer it's a whole process. Along with that, it's not just about who you're attracted to, but also what that means to you as a person and
Mhm.
how that's going to affect your life coming on out. You kind of realize that there's a lot of institutional prejudice set up against you. You have to come to terms with yourself, and you also have to come to terms with people not liking you for who you are. Yeah, this is kind of depressing actually. But yeah, other common themes are, I guess, really about institutions. There's a lot of talk about how schools and how NS kind of just systematically screws you over. There's talk about how they deal with mental health in these places, how there isn't really a proper support system if you don't have the capacity to like go looking for it, because the ones readily available to you, you don't know whether you can really be yourself. And so that's a whole issue of like institutional stigma, I guess. It's really talking about the system of schools and how queer people are kind of dealt with or not acknowledged in the system, I guess. Yeah. On a brighter note, like most of the entries there talk about, not to be cliche, but like the kind of inner strength that you need to deal with all this. Really being queer kind of forces you to become a better person in a sense. You just have to continue living on. The themes found in the entries in my archive are kind of just the themes of just everyday life, but what happens if you have to deal with a system that's not set up to fit your existence?
So, speaking about your archive, how do you see it fitting in with other local queer initiatives such as the LGBT Wiki or Pink Dot? So, where does your archive fit in?
It has a few functions, I think. For one, it's a more academic resource. I'm trying to make this a proper, quote unquote, proper oral history archive so that it can be used as an academic resource for people studying queer history in Singapore. So yeah, this comes with like the way that the transcripts are formatted. Like we're kind of working on that right now. I'm very lucky to have a few people who volunteer to help out with transcribing and also with formatting. And two of them happen to be history majors. So I'm very lucky to like have them help me with figuring out how to make a transcript like a proper format for like academic use, and also how to ask questions. Also, it adds a sort of more human element, I guess. Like the LGBT wiki is very useful, but ultimately it is still a wiki. It's not quite the human connection that a young isolated queer person can figure out while trying to find a community. And like Pink Dot is a big event. It's unifying because it's the one queer event in Singapore every year, but there needs to be something a little more. And I think that the archive kind of fills in the gaps a little bit because you can't really form much a connection with people who show up in like a few minute video clips over a huge event once a year. I've gotten a few messages from people who have been listening to the entries in the archive and reading the transcripts. And they really do go along the lines of like being grateful for this kind of resource because it helps them feel less alone. And I think that's especially important in this pandemic. Yeah, because as a queer person in Singapore, especially in an isolating environment, it can really feel kind of very, very lonely, I guess. And so I think that the entries in this archive also help to form that kind of human connection with not quite the queer community, but definitely queer people in Singapore.
Now, you've mentioned about how your archive fits into other queer initiatives. Why is it important that Singaporeans, regardless of sexuality, should listen to what your interviewees have to say?
Well, because ultimately, although the name says it's a queer oral history archive, it is basically another oral history archive. It's about human stories, it's about people. And quite frankly, we really need a source of like actual queer stories in Singapore because I know that there's a lot of like literature, especially from queer authors, but there's a bit of a difference, I think, because oral history, at least the way I've been doing it so far, is basically autobiography of a sort. Really, if you listen to them, you're not necessarily listening to a bunch of queer people talk about being queer, but you're listening to a bunch of people talk about their lives and they happen to be queer. Regardless of sexuality, like I think everyone is interested in how other people live. Yeah, I kind of joked about it to my friends. It's like kind of getting to capo into other people's lives because each entry is kind of what each person wants to talk about, like wants their life to be known as. You can get things like Loon's entries, Loon Lo, who took 2 4-hour sessions. And yeah, she talks very much in detail about her entire childhood and her entire philosophy and everything she read. And then you can get like a short 20 plus minute conversation about just like how being queer is fitting into who they are because it's new. So yeah, it's basically, you can also think of it as like a bunch of human interest stories. Queer history in itself is quite interesting. Like I haven't really managed to get like too much history per se because yeah, most of the entries in my archive are from younger people, but there is a history to be had and it isn't shown in what we would consider Singapore history or like typical history books because queer history doesn't really get recorded outside of the queer community. And our community, the queer community in Singapore, is unfortunately quite small. There is a lot of history, but it's very much word of mouth. I guess like a future hope for this archive is that I'll be able to get some, like connect to some older people who can tell me more about that history, like the history of Bugis Street or how gay hookup culture in Singapore has changed. There's a lot of things that have been alluded to in some of the entries in the archive already. It's just really interesting. You get to learn about people and you get to learn about a whole nother side of Singapore that you never thought about.
So, in a way, it kind of helps to fill in some of the gaps that we see in the Singapore story, essentially.
Yeah, you can kind of think of it like that. I think that the Singapore story is very polished and kind of just tries to overlook anything not very flattering of Singapore. That makes sense because it's the official state narrative, the Singapore story, with like capital letters and everything. But other than having an official narrative, there should really be room for more stories in Singapore. Like history can't just be that one single narrative. That's how I would hope that this archive kind of deals with it.
So, you've explain what you hope to achieve with this archive. So, finally, for those who are interested in contributing to this initiative, what should they do?
If you're queer and you want to overshare about your life, just email at sgqueeroralhistory@gmail.com, or I'm on the archive is on Twitter and Instagram. Twitter is sgqueeroralhis1. Instagram is sgquoha, all small letters, no spaces. If you just want to listen, we have a website and a podcast on Spotify, the Singapore Queer Oral History Podcast. Yeah, if you want to research, by all means, please do. This is kind of what this was meant to help with. Please email me if you want to use the research, and I would be really interested to see what kind of things people make of it.